In January of 1967, Time magazine was preparing a cover. The face on it belonged to a 41-year-old engineer named Joseph Shea, the man running the machine that was supposed to carry Americans to the moon. He had taken a program drowning in its own paperwork and made it move, and by the measure of that winter he was the most important engineer in the United States that almost no one outside NASA had ever heard of. The cover never ran. On January 27th, 3 astronauts died on a launch pad, in a fire, inside the spacecraft his office had built. 70 days later, NASA moved Joseph Shea to a desk in Washington with no program left to run. Within the year, he was gone. This is the story of the spacecraft he built, the decision he made that put men on the moon, and the 90 days in which the program he had saved erased him from its own record. Joseph Francis Shea was born on the 5th of September, 1925, in the Bronx, in New York City. He came up out of working-class New York, the tenement blocks and the elevated trains, with no engineering pedigree behind him and no Ivy League pipeline waiting ahead. What he had was a mind built for a single question, the question that would define everything he ever touched. How do thousands of separate parts, made by different hands, who never meet, get assembled into one machine that works? He carried that question to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and took a degree in mathematics and engineering in 1946. He was not a man assembled by inheritance, he was assembled by discipline, and he sharpened that discipline harder than almost anyone of his generation. He stayed in Ann Arbor and went deeper into it. A master's degree followed in 1950. And in 1955 the University of Michigan granted him a doctorate in engineering mechanics. For stretches in those years he also taught at Michigan, standing at the chalkboard in front of the engineers who would come after him. And across that same decade something new was forming inside American engineering, a discipline that did not yet have a settled name. It was called systems engineering, and it concerned itself not with any one component, but with the integration of enormous projects. The art of turning the scattered work of hundreds of engineers and dozens of competing contractors into a single functioning whole. That idea, the system as the real object of design, would become the spine of Joseph Shea's entire career. He was not going to be the man who built the part. He was going to be the man who made the parts agree. But the place that discipline was actually being forged was not the lecture hall. It was the missile programs of the Cold War. Shea went to Bell Labs, and there he worked on the radio inertial guidance systems for the Titan intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Titan I and the Titan II, the silo-borne weapons standing ready beneath the American planes. Guidance was the most unforgiving work in all of aerospace. A missile does not get a second flight to learn from. One integration error, a single mismatched assumption between 2 teams who never spoke to each other, and the whole system fails at the one moment it cannot be allowed to fail. On the Titan, Joseph Shea learned the cold arithmetic of things that are never given a second chance. He learned to trust hard data over hope, and to distrust any number that no one had actually gone back and checked. Therefore, when NASA went looking for a man who could impose order on a program that was already tearing itself to pieces, his name was sitting at the top of the list. NASA hired him in 1961 and made him a deputy director in the Office of Manned Spaceflight. He walked into the most ambitious deadline in the history of engineering, and into a race the United States was losing. That April, the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin had become the first human being in space, and the Americans had answered weeks later with a single short suborbital hop. Against that scoreboard, President Kennedy had committed the United States to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely before the end of the decade, and the country had cheered the speech, and almost no one had stopped to notice that nobody on Earth actually knew how to do it. The rocket would have to be the largest flying machine ever assembled. The moonship did not exist, not even on paper in any final form. And underneath all of it sat one question so fundamental that the agency could not even agree on the answer. A question that had to be settled before a single bolt of the spacecraft could be designed for real. That question was the mode. How exactly would the spacecraft reach the lunar surface and get its crew home alive? By 1962, there were three competing answers, and the argument among them split NASA into warring camps. The first was direct ascent, in which one enormous spacecraft would fly to the moon, land as a single unit, and lift off again for the return journey. The second was Earth orbit rendezvous, in which the pieces would be assembled in orbit around the Earth before departure. Most of the agency, including Wernher von Braun and his rocket team at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, favored one of these two. The third option was the one nearly everyone considered too dangerous to take seriously. It was called Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, and its lonely champion was a Langley engineer named John Hobbolt, who had grown so frustrated being ignored that he wrote a blunt letter straight over the heads of his superiors to the Associate Administrator Robert Siemens, demanding to know why his idea was being treated as heresy. Into that fight, Joseph Shea directed the conceptual studies that finally put hard numbers to the argument. And the numbers favored the dangerous one. Lunar Orbit Rendezvous works like this. You do not haul the entire spacecraft down to the surface and back up again. You split it in two. A command and service module stays in orbit around the moon, while a separate, lighter lunar module detaches, descends to the surface, and afterward climbs back up to find its mothership in lunar orbit. The weight that this architecture saves is staggering, and that saved weight is the exact difference between a moon landing that fits inside Kennedy's decade and one that does not. The price was a single, terrifying requirement. Two spacecraft would have to locate each other and dock in orbit around the moon, 250,000 miles from any rescue, with no margin and no way home if they failed. Shea's studies substantiated that the feasibility and the advantages were real. At an all-day meeting at Marshall in June of 1962, von Braun himself stood up and reversed his position, publicly endorsing the very approach his center had doubted, because the savings in weight and time were too large to ignore. On the 11th of July, the administrator James Webb announced the decision to the world. The men who would later walk on the moon flew the architecture those studies had carried. But winning the argument over the architecture was the easy part. Choosing how to reach the moon is a decision made in conference rooms. Now someone had to actually build the spacecraft that the decision demanded, and that work was already a disaster. In October of 1963, Joseph Shea became the manager of the Apollo Spacecraft Program Office, based at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, Texas. The title meant he now held direct responsibility for the design and the construction of the two machines the entire mission depended on: the Command and Service Module and the Lunar Module. Those were two very different machines, built by two different contractors on opposite coasts. North American Aviation assembling the Command and Service Module in Downey, California, and Grumman building the spidery, fragile-looking Lunar Module out on Long Island in New York. Shea's office had to make each of them work, and then make the two of them work together 250,000 miles away. The office he inherited was a graveyard for managers. It had already burned out two of his predecessors. NASA and its prime contractor, North American Aviation, were locked in something close to open warfare over how the command module should be built. And a flood of engineering change requests was rising fast enough to drown the program before it ever left the ground. The historians Charles Murray and Catherine Cox, in their account of the program, described an effort that had been foundering, and a man who walked in and drove it forward. For Joseph Shea, the assignment was never really about invention. It was about control. He found his way to control through a man on the other side of the war. Shea reached an accommodation with Harrison Storms, the head of North American Aviation's space division out in Downey, California, the contractor's own embattled leader. Together they stemmed the flood of change requests and the endless disagreements. And Shea imposed the engineering discipline he had carried out of the Titan years. His insistence was on what he called engineering confidence, the principle that you do not believe a thing works until it has been empirically validated, and that you never fly on faith. Slowly the command module stopped being an argument and started being hardware. It was designed, It was built, and it was tested. And the cabin that was taking shape on the assembly floor in Downey, the pressurized capsule with its wiring bundles and its interior materials and its inward sealing hatch, was the same cabin that the rest of this story turns on. That partnership was never a clean one, and it is worth being honest about both sides of it. Storms believed that NASA itself was far from blameless for the chaos, that the agency had been slow to make key design decisions, and then kept ordering significant changes to the spacecraft long after construction had already begun. Changes that rippled back through the factory and broke the schedule again and again. Shea, for his part, did not always sympathize with the day-to-day realities of building hardware, and he could be cutting about them. He was a controversial figure even inside his own side of the program. He had not come up through the Langley Space Task Group with the men who built Mercury, and to insiders like the flight director Chris Kraft, he was an outsider who had been handed enormous power, with Kraft later remembering the animosity between his people and Shea's as intense. Even so, almost no one disputed the engineering, and there had already been a warning written down. In late 1965, NASA's Apollo program director Samuel Phillips had led a review team into North America's plants to investigate the delays and the cost overruns, and the report he wrote afterward was blunt about the contractor's management and the quality of its work. It was filed, and it was noted, and the program kept moving. Shea drove it forward anyway. By the time the first crewed flight was being prepared, he had brought the Apollo spacecraft to flight readiness only about 5 months behind its original plan, which, given the wreckage of an office he had inherited, was close to a miracle of management. He had taken an office that had broken 2 men before him and turned it into a program that was finally going to fly, and he had done it nearly on time. That was supposed to be the story. But forward momentum carries a danger of its own. A program that is finally moving does not like being told to stop, and the schedule was closing fast toward the first flight with 3 men aboard. There was one more bet to place before that flight, and it was a reckless one. The Saturn V, the giant moon rocket rising stage by stage inside the assembly building at Cape Canaveral in Florida, was traditionally meant to be tested one piece at a time, each stage proven on its own before the next was trusted with a flight. The Associate Administrator George Mueller proposed instead to test the entire rocket all up, every stage live on the very first launch. Old rocketry called it madness. The calendar called it the only path that reached the moon in time. Shea backed the all-up approach, and it held. By the end of 1966, Joseph Shea was the engineer who had taken a foundering moon program and made it fly, and his name had climbed into the company of von Braun and the flight director Chris Kraft. Therefore, Time magazine, which had already given Kraft its cover in 1965, prepared to give Shea the same honor in February of 1967, the very month the first crewed Apollo mission was scheduled to launch. But the spacecraft was not ready, and the men who would fly it knew it better than anyone. By late 1966, a culture the engineers themselves named Go Fever had taken hold across NASA and its thousands of contractors. The rush to hit delivery dates and keep the schedule moving. The quiet willingness to wave small problems through rather than miss a deadline. The early Block 1 command module prepared for the first mission was a product of that fever. It had been shipped to Florida carrying more than 100 unresolved engineering problems. A faulty glycol pump in the cooling system, leaking thrusters, bad wiring, software that was not finished. To the men assigned to ride it, Gus Grissom and his backup Wally Schirra, it was a sloppy and unsafe machine, and they said so. Inside that cabin were 3 conditions that would later read like an indictment written in advance. The atmosphere was 100% oxygen, pressurized on the pad to 16.7 pounds per square inch. An environment in which materials that merely smolder in ordinary air will catch and race. Throughout the interior ran flammable nylon netting and Velcro fastenings, convenient to work with and dangerously combustible. And then there was the hatch. It sealed inward, held shut by the cabin's own pressure, a design that took more than 90 seconds to open from inside under the best of conditions. North American had wanted a single-piece hatch fitted with explosive bolts that could blow clear in an instant. NASA had rejected that idea, in part because of Gus Grissom himself. On his Mercury flight in 1961, Grissom's explosive hatch had fired prematurely after splashdown. The capsule had flooded and sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic, and he had nearly drowned. So the planners chose the hatch that could not blow open by accident, the inward sealing hatch that, on the ground, could barely be opened at all. Joseph Shea had ordered the flammable materials in the cabin reduced. In spite of those orders, they were never fully removed. Grissom had stopped trusting the spacecraft long before. On a visit home to Texas on the 22nd of January 1967, he walked out to the tree in his backyard, plucked a lemon, and told his wife he was going to hang it on that spacecraft. And he did. His crew had already handed Joseph Shea a mock version of their official portrait, the three of them with heads bowed and hands clasped in prayer over a model of their capsule. A joke with a blade inside it. But nobody in the program believed that the test on the schedule could actually kill anyone. The rocket would be unfueled. The capsule would simply be sealed and run through a simulated countdown. It was, by every assumption in the building, the safe test, the one with nothing in it that could go wrong. On the 27th of January, 1967, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were sealed into the Apollo 1 command module on top of Launch Pad 34 at Cape Canaveral for that plugs-out test. Grissom was one of the original Mercury 7 and the second American ever to fly in space. White was the first American to walk in space 2 years earlier on Gemini. Chaffee was a rookie who had never flown at all, still waiting for the first mission of his life. There is a detail from that morning that would follow Joseph Shea for the rest of his life. Grissom, worn down by communication failures that kept garbling the cabin's radio, had asked Shea over breakfast whether he might climb in alongside the crew and see the problems for himself. Shea actually weighed it. He considered rigging up an extra headset and folding himself in his shirt sleeves into the lower equipment bay of the spacecraft to listen in. In the end, he decided against it, and he watched from outside the capsule. The test wore on into the early evening, plagued the whole way by the same static on the communication loop that had tormented the crew for weeks. Then sensors registered a brief surge of power inside the spacecraft. In that pure oxygen cabin, a spark found something to burn. The crew called out fire over the loop that had been failing all afternoon, and within seconds the fire was beyond them. The inward sealing hatch could not be opened against the heat and the pressure in time. All three men died on the pad, in the spacecraft that Joseph Shea's office had built, on a mission that had been scheduled to launch only weeks later, on the 21st of February. The Federal Review Board that followed would document every condition that had made the disaster possible. That board, chaired by the Langley director Floyd Thompson, and including the astronaut Frank Borman, took the wreckage apart condition by condition. They traced the likely ignition to worn wiring low in the spacecraft. They found a sealed cabin flooded with pure oxygen at high pressure, far too much flammable material packed in around it, and a hatch that could not be opened from inside in anything close to the time the men had. Borman would later put it to the Congress in a single phrase that has outlived almost everything else said about the accident. The cause, he testified, had been a failure of imagination. No one had truly imagined that the safe test, the unfueled rehearsal on the ground, was the one that could kill. Therefore, the question that would govern everything left of his career arrived in a single sentence. He had been one decision away from being inside that cabin himself, and the machine that killed his friends was his. Joseph Shea threw himself into the investigation. The lost crew had not been abstractions to him. They had been colleagues and friends, and he took the failure as a personal debt that had to be paid. The accounts of those weeks describe a man working 80-hour weeks and unraveling under the weight of them, reaching for sedatives to sleep and stimulants to stay upright, the structure of his own composure beginning to give way under him. There is a bitter symmetry in it that the record does not soften. the finest systems engineer of his generation, the man who could hold the largest machine in America together inside his own head, could not control the one system that was himself. Murray and Cox, who chronicled the program in detail, did not look away from how far he fell. But NASA had a program to save and a reckoning waiting for it in Washington. The agency was about to face the Congress and the country over 3 dead astronauts, and a program manager visibly coming apart was a weight the institution decided it could not carry into those hearings. On the 5th of April, 1967, about 70 days after the fire, the Associate Administrator George Mueller announced that Joseph Shea would become his deputy at NASA headquarters in Washington, with responsibility for the technical side of the human spaceflight program. On paper, the move carried the language of a promotion. In substance, it was a desk with no moon in it. Mueller named the Manned Spacecraft Center's deputy director, George Lowe, as the new manager of the Apollo Spacecraft Program Office, effective the 10th of April. The record can be read 2 ways, and honesty requires holding both at once. NASA presented the move as advancement. The people who watched it happen, and the historians who later studied it, read it as the quiet removal of a man who could no longer carry the load, and as a program closing ranks to protect itself in a dangerous season. Whichever reading is true, the arithmetic is not in dispute. Within 90 days of the Apollo 1 fire, the engineer who had built the Apollo spacecraft no longer ran it. The following year, in 1968, Joseph Shea left NASA entirely. And Joseph Shea was not the only man chosen to carry the failure. As the investigation hardened into a search for someone to blame, North America found itself positioned to take the fall for the fire, and the Senate Space Committee dug up the very document that had warned of trouble 18 months earlier, the Phillips report on the contractor's management. North America did not want to see NASA's authority broken, because North America wanted to keep selling NASA rockets and spacecraft for years to come. So heads rolled on both sides of the table. NASA had already given up Shea. Now the company's chief executive, Lee Atwood, removed Harrison Storms from the program and moved him to a desk elsewhere in the corporation. The 2 men who had fought each other across that table for 3 years. The NASA manager and the contractor's leader were also the 2 men most responsible for the fact that there was a working spacecraft to fight over at all. When the program needed someone to answer for the dead, those were the 2 it chose. It is one of the quiet patterns of large institutions under fire that the people standing closest to the hardest work are often the most convenient to blame. And then the program flew without him, which is the cruelest turn in the whole account. Everything the fire had exposed was fixed. The hatch was redesigned to swing outward and open in seconds. The cabin atmosphere on the pad was changed, and the flammable materials were stripped out. The very hazards the disaster had laid bare. The command module that Shea's office had fought into existence was rebuilt, and in October of 1968, Apollo 7 carried a crew into orbit aboard the redesigned spacecraft and brought them home safely, the first crewed Apollo flight, proof that the machine could fly. The all-up gamble on the Saturn V had already paid off as well. The first complete rocket flying successfully in November of 1967, though by then Shea was gone from the program that was proving him right. In December of 1968, Apollo 8 carried 3 men all the way around the moon and back, the first time human beings had ever left the gravity of the Earth, and the spacecraft his office had built held the whole way. Then, in July of 1969, Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and it did so on the lunar orbit rendezvous architecture that Joseph Shea's studies had carried back in 1962. 2 spacecraft separated in orbit around the moon, and one descended to the Sea of Tranquility while the other waited above, and later they found each other and docked again in lunar orbit. Exactly the dangerous maneuver the mode had always demanded. The decision he helped force through put human beings on the surface of another world. He watched it from outside the agency, a private citizen by then, his name nowhere on the mission. But the engineering record is plain. And the engineering record is the thing this channel keeps. The man who was removed from the program is the same man whose two largest calls, the choice of lunar orbit rendezvous and the disciplined rebuilding of the spacecraft office, are the reasons the landing was possible at all. After NASA, Joseph Shea built the rest of a long and serious career in industry, spending more than 2 decades as a senior engineering executive at Raytheon in Lexington, Massachusetts, from 1968 until 1990. Only afterward, near the end of his working life, did he arrive at the institution that careless retellings like to place at the front of his story. He became an adjunct professor of aeronautics and astronautics at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, more than 20 years after Apollo, teaching the systems thinking he had spent a lifetime proving in hardware. In 1993, NASA called him back one last time to consult on the redesign of the International Space Station, and failing health forced him to step away from it. Joseph Shea died on the 14th of February 1999 at his home in Weston, Massachusetts. His old colleague George Mueller remembered him as one of the greatest systems engineers of our time. The cover that actually ran the week of February 3rd, 1967 did not carry Joseph Shea's face. It carried 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. Standing in front of Launch Pad 34, the men who died in the spacecraft he had built. He never got his cover. The architecture got the moon. The hatch that failed was redesigned and made to open outward. The program he was removed from reached the lunar surface on the very mode he had championed, and the engineering discipline he carried out of the Titan years is still, to this day, how the largest machines on Earth are built. His name came off the Apollo program in 70 days. It stayed in the design. From the Rocket Archives. Subscribe.